On the night of November 5th, 2004, a group of young men had been drinking for several hours at Shaker's Bar in Stockton, California. Among them were Clifford, Jeremy, Derek, Justin, and Jack. The court record describes the group as drunk and rowdy that night. Shortly before 11 p.m., Robert, Frankie, and Frankie's wife Teresa arrived at Shaker's. Robert and Frankie were members of the Just Brothers Motorcycle Club and were wearing leather vests displaying the club's patch. They parked their motorcycles directly outside the bar, went inside, and mostly kept to themselves. After a short time, they prepared to leave. According to the bartender, Clifford had already been arguing with the bikers and said there was going to be a fight. When Robert and Frankie walked outside, a large number of people followed them into the parking lot. Exactly how the confrontation started became heavily disputed. Jeremy testified that Clifford told Robert to have a white night. Clifford admitted someone used the phrase, but gave a different account of what he personally said. Robert responded, "What did you fucking say?" The bartender testified that Clifford was yelling at Robert with his fists raised, moving around like a boxer. At the same time, Jeremy was arguing with Frankie and threatening to beat him up. Other witnesses heard members of the group telling the bikers to leave, threatening to beat them, and challenging them to fight without weapons. The confrontation quickly grew, with somewhere between 15 and 25 people eventually gathered in the parking lot. Robert pulled out a crescent wrench, while Frankie retrieved a large Maglite flashlight from his motorcycle. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts of what happened next. Some described Robert and Frankie as being surrounded and attacked by a much larger group. Others described both sides as actively participating in the confrontation. At some point, Jeremy and Derek were stabbed. Derek testified that he saw Robert stab Jeremy underneath the arm during a confrontation between the two. Robert disputed that account and claimed another man was responsible for stabbing Jeremy. There was also conflicting testimony supporting Robert's version, and Jeremy himself couldn't identify who stabbed him. The jury ultimately determined there was sufficient evidence that Robert was responsible. Robert admitted stabbing Derek, although he claimed he did it in self-defense. According to Robert, he was being attacked by several people when Derek came toward him swinging a cable. Robert said he pulled out a utility knife and swung it at Derek because he believed he was in danger. Derek gave a different account, testifying that Robert came from behind and stabbed him. The knife entered Derek's left side near his shoulder and punctured his lung. He developed blood between his lung and chest cavity, underwent surgery, and remained hospitalized for 5 days. While all of this was happening, Mark arrived at Shaker's with several friends. Mark hadn't been part of the original confrontation. Witnesses described the scene he walked into as chaotic, with a large group surrounding the two bikers and people yelling, pushing, and fighting. Mark eventually had an encounter with Teresa. Accounts differed over exactly what happened between them. Witnesses testified that Teresa pushed past Mark and that Mark yelled at her. Other testimony described Mark backing away with his hands raised and saying he didn't know her. Teresa then called out for Frankie. Frankie ran toward them, carrying the Maglite, and struck Mark in the head with it. Frankie and Mark began wrestling before falling to the ground. Several other people became involved as the two men struggled on the pavement. Witnesses described people kicking them and trying to pull them apart. Then someone yelled that there was a knife. Moments later, Mark managed to get up. He staggered several steps before collapsing in the street. He had been stabbed. Mark was rushed to the hospital while receiving CPR. Doctors discovered that he had suffered massive blood loss from a stab wound that injured his pulmonary artery. He also had a deep defensive wound across his left palm. His upper front teeth had been knocked out, and he had injuries to his head consistent with being struck by a blunt object such as the Maglite. Doctors performed surgery, but Mark died at 3:25 that morning from shock and hemorrhage caused by the stab wound. Frankie later admitted that he stabbed Mark, but maintained that he had acted in defense of himself and Teresa. According to Frankie, he saw Mark threatening his wife and struck him with the flashlight. Frankie claimed Mark then ended up on top of him while other people kicked him. Frankie said he pulled out his knife while on the ground. According to his testimony, Mark grabbed the hand holding the knife and pushed downward during the struggle. Frankie claimed he twisted his hand, after which Mark got up, attempted to run, and collapsed. Frankie maintained that he pulled the knife only to get Mark off him and never intended to kill him. Robert also maintained that he believed he was fighting for his life during the larger confrontation. The appellate court later emphasized how difficult it was to reconstruct exactly what happened. Many witnesses had been drinking. Witnesses were associated with different sides of the fight, and several accounts changed or contradicted one another. Immediately after the stabbings, Robert, Frankie, and Teresa left on their motorcycles. Robert and Frankie both admitted disposing of their knives afterward. Neither contacted police that night. Frankie eventually arranged to surrender and turned himself in several days later. Robert surrendered the following day. Both men had cut their hair and shaved their facial hair by the time they turned themselves in. Frankie was eventually convicted of second-degree murder for Mark's death. Robert was convicted of 2 counts of attempted voluntary manslaughter for the stabbings of Jeremy and Derek, along with 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon. But the case didn't end there. Robert and Frankie appealed their convictions, arguing, in part, that the jury had been improperly exposed to extensive evidence portraying the Just brothers as an outlaw motorcycle gang connected to the Hells Angels. The appellate court agreed. The court found there wasn't a sufficient foundation to establish that the Just brothers were a criminal gang or criminal enterprise. It concluded that extensive testimony and arguments about the club, its alleged culture, 1%er status, and supposed connection to the Hells Angels unfairly portrayed Robert and Frankie as men predisposed to violence. Because the case depended heavily on conflicting witness accounts and whether Robert and Frankie reasonably believed they were defending themselves or others, the appellate court determined that evidence could have improperly influenced how jurors judged their credibility. As a result, Frankie's second-degree murder conviction and Robert's remaining convictions were reversed, allowing those charges to potentially be retried. The court went even further with Robert's conviction involving Jeremy. Although it found there was enough evidence for the jury to conclude Robert stabbed Jeremy, it found insufficient evidence that Robert specifically intended to kill him. Because attempted voluntary manslaughter required an intent to kill, that conviction was reversed for insufficient evidence and could not be retried. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.